What was the Berlin airlift?
It was the response during 1948 and 1949 to the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. After World War II, 1939–45, the German city had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But following the conclusion of the war, it did not take long for the Cold War, 1947–89, between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to heat up. When the Americans, British, and French agreed to combine their 3 areas of Berlin into one economic entity, the Soviets responded by cutting the area off from all supply routes. In June 1948, all arteries, road, rail, and water into West Berlin were blocked by Soviet troops. Since Berlin was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, the Soviets clearly believed the blockade would be an effective move that would prompt the Western countries to pull out. But the move failed. The Americans, British, and French set up a massive airlift. For the next 11 months, West Berlin was supplied with food and fuel entirely by airplanes. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift ended by September.
What was the Berlin airlift?
It was the response during 1948 and 1949 to the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. After World War II, 1939–45, the German city had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But following the conclusion of the war, it did not take long for the Cold War, 1947–89, between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to heat up. When the Americans, British, and French agreed to combine their 3 areas of Berlin into one economic entity, the Soviets responded by cutting the area off from all supply routes. In June 1948, all arteries, road, rail, and water into West Berlin were blocked by Soviet troops. Since Berlin was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, the Soviets clearly believed the blockade would be an effective move that would prompt the Western countries to pull out. But the move failed. The Americans, British, and French set up a massive airlift. For the next 11 months, West Berlin was supplied with food and fuel entirely by airplanes. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift ended by September.
What is NATO?
NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed on April 4, 1949, when 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The original 12 NATO countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each member nation agreed to treat attacks on any other member nation as if it were an attack on itself. In other words, any aggressor would have to face the entire alliance. This was NATO's policy of deterrence. A way of discouraging any attacks by the Soviet Union or other Eastern Bloc countries. The organization had the further benefit of discouraging fighting among the member countries. 3 years after it was formed, the alliance was joined by Greece and Turkey, in 1952. West Germany followed 3 years after that, in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of communism and the reunification of East and West Germany, c. 1990, all of Germany joined the alliance. At this point, with the Cold War, 1947–89, over, many wondered what purpose the organization could serve. After all, the Soviet threat was no longer existent. However, other conflicts loomed on the horizon, including those in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Fearing the civil war in the former Yugoslav Republic would spread, NATO sent in troops on the side of the Bosnian government. NATO also formed the Partnership for Peace in 1994. This program was joined by more than 20 countries, including former Eastern Bloc nations, including Russia. Though these nations are not full members in the NATO alliance, the Partnership for Peace provides for joint military planning among signing nations. On March 12, 1999, 3 former Eastern Bloc nations were given full membership in NATO: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Observers hailed the additions as evidence that Europe is becoming more unified. On April 23, 1999, the 50th anniversary of the alliance's founding, the 19 NATO member nations gathered in Washington, D.C., to commemorate the event, just after NATO had begun air-bombing Yugoslavia. To pressure the government there to accept international terms aimed at bringing peace to the nation's Kosovo province, where ethnic conflicts between Serbs and Albanians had turned deadly. NATO is governed by the North Atlantic Council, which is made up of the heads of government of member nations or their representatives. It was headquartered in Paris until 1967, at which time the offices were moved to Brussels, Belgium.
What is NATO?
NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed on April 4, 1949, when 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The original 12 NATO countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each member nation agreed to treat attacks on any other member nation as if it were an attack on itself. In other words, any aggressor would have to face the entire alliance. This was NATO's policy of deterrence. a way of discouraging any attacks by the Soviet Union or other Eastern Bloc countries. The organization had the further benefit of discouraging fighting among the member countries. 3 years after it was formed, the alliance was joined by Greece and Turkey, in 1952. West Germany followed 3 years after that, in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of communism and the reunification of East and West Germany, c. 1990, all of Germany joined the alliance. At this point, with the Cold War, 1947–89, over, many wondered what purpose the organization could serve. After all, the Soviet threat was no longer existent. However, other conflicts loomed on the horizon, including those in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Fearing the civil war in the former Yugoslav Republic would spread, NATO sent in troops on the side of the Bosnian government. NATO also formed the Partnership for Peace in 1994. This program was joined by more than 20 countries, including former Eastern Bloc nations, including Russia. Though these nations are not full members in the NATO alliance, the Partnership for Peace provides for joint military planning among signing nations. On March 12, 1999, 3 former Eastern Bloc nations were given full membership in NATO: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Observers hailed the additions as evidence that Europe is becoming more unified. On April 23, 1999, the 50th anniversary of the alliance's founding, the 19 NATO member nations gathered in Washington, D.C., to commemorate the event, just after NATO had begun air-bombing Yugoslavia. To pressure the government there to accept international terms aimed at bringing peace to the nation's Kosovo province, where ethnic conflicts between Serbs and Albanians had turned deadly. NATO is governed by the North Atlantic Council, which is made up of the heads of government of member nations or their representatives. It was headquartered in Paris until 1967, at which time the offices were moved to Brussels, Belgium.
What was the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc countries' answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Seeing the Western nations form a strong alliance, in May 1955 the Soviet Union and its allies met in Warsaw, Poland, where they signed a treaty agreeing that they, too, would mutually defend one another. The 8 member nations were Albania, which withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was headquartered in Moscow and, in addition to discouraging attacks from Western Bloc/NATO countries, the organization also sought to quell any democratic uprisings in Warsaw Pact nations. But in 1990 the pact and the Soviet Union's control of it weakened, as democracy movements in member nations could not be put down. As the former Eastern Bloc countries underwent relatively peaceful revolutions, Warsaw Pact members began announcing their intentions to withdraw from the organization. East Germany withdrew when it was reunified with West Germany. And the restored Germany joined NATO, in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved by the remaining member nations in 1991.
What was the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc countries' answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Seeing the Western nations form a strong alliance, in May 1955 the Soviet Union and its allies met in Warsaw, Poland, where they signed a treaty agreeing that they, too, would mutually defend one another. The 8 member nations were Albania, which withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was headquartered in Moscow and, in addition to discouraging attacks from Western Bloc/NATO countries, the organization also sought to quell any democratic uprisings in Warsaw Pact nations. But in 1990 the pact and the Soviet Union's control of it weakened. As democracy movements in member nations could not be put down. As the former Eastern Bloc countries underwent relatively peaceful revolutions, Warsaw Pact members began announcing their intentions to withdraw from the organization. East Germany withdrew when it was reunified with West Germany. And the restored Germany joined NATO, in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved by the remaining member nations in 1991.
What was the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc countries' answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Seeing the Western nations form a strong alliance, in May 1955 the Soviet Union and its allies met in Warsaw, Poland, where they signed a treaty agreeing that they, too, would mutually defend one another. The 8 member nations were Albania, which withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was headquartered in Moscow and, in addition to discouraging attacks from Western Bloc/NATO countries, the organization also sought to quell any democratic uprisings in Warsaw Pact nations. But in 1990 the pact and the Soviet Union's control of it weakened. As democracy movements in member nations could not be put down. As the former Eastern Bloc countries underwent relatively peaceful revolutions, Warsaw Pact members began announcing their intentions to withdraw from the organization. East Germany withdrew when it was reunified with West Germany. And the restored Germany joined NATO, in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved by the remaining member nations in 1991.
What caused the War of 1812?
The war between the young United States and powerful Great Britain largely came about because of France. After the French navy was crushed by the British under Admiral Nelson. 1758 to 1805, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon turned to economic warfare in his long struggle with the British. He directed all countries under French control not to trade with Great Britain. Its economy dependent on trade, Britain struck back by imposing a naval blockade on France, which soon interfered with U.S. shipping. Ever since the struggle between the two European powers began in 1793, the United States tried to remain neutral. But the interruption of shipping to and from the continent and the search and seizure of ships posed significant problems to the American export business. In 1807, Great Britain had issued an order in council that required even neutral vessels destined for a continental port to stop first in England. Napoleon countered with the Milan Decree, which stated that any neutral vessel that had submitted to British search be seized. Back in America, the people of New England, the region most dependent on shipping, nevertheless vehemently opposed entering into war with the British. But the country's economy was depressed as a result of the interruption of exports. And the U.S. Congress declared war on June 18, 1812. In these days before telegraph and radio, the United States did not know that 2 days before, on June 16, Britain had withdrawn its orders in council, lifting its policy of shipping interference, which had been the chief reason for the war declaration. Thus the two countries engaged in fighting for the next 2.5 years. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent officially ended the war. But once again, poor communication led to fighting, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed. Troops in New Orleans, unaware of this event, fought for control over the Mississippi River in the worst battle of the entire conflict. Though both the United States and Great Britain claimed victory in the War of 1812, neither side had gained anything.
How many countries were part of the Axis powers?
The Axis, which was forged in 1936, included an alliance of 3 nations, Germany, Italy, and Japan. These major powers were joined by 6 smaller countries. The Axis satellites, Albania, Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Thailand. But together these countries never comprised the unified front and strength that the Allied powers did. Germany started the war on September 1, 1939, and was joined in June 1940 by Italy and Albania. In the middle of 1941, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Finland joined the Axis effort. Japan, which was already fighting with China, in the Sino-Japanese War, entered the fray on December 7, 1941, with its attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Thailand was the last Axis country to enter the war, on January 25, 1942.
What happened at Trafalgar?
Cape Trafalgar, on the southwest coast of Spain, was in 1805 the scene of a decisive victory for Great Britain over Napoleon Bonaparte's 1769–1821 navy. Other than a one-year respite in 1802, France and Britain had been at war with each other since. 1793 Napoleon remained determined to conquer Britain, just as he had most of continental Europe. But when his fleets met those of decorated English Admiral Horatio Nelson, 1758–1805, off the coast of Spain, the certain defeat and destruction of Napoleon's navy ended the emperor's hopes of invading England. The confrontation at Trafalgar was the culmination of a two-year game of cat and mouse between Nelson's fleets and the French under the direction of Admiral Villeneuve. 1763–1806, whose sole objective it was to invade Britain. To prevent this from happening, in 1803 Nelson began a two-year blockade of Villeneuve and the French navy at Toulon, France, on the Mediterranean coast. When the French fleets escaped Toulon, attempting to lure the British out to sea, Nelson chased them all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies and back before the showdown off Spain's coast, where the French were joined by Spanish fleets. Meantime, the coast of England remained protected by the British Navy, leaving no opportunity for invasion by the French. On October 21, 1805, seeing the enemy sailing out of Trafalgar, Nelson formed his fleet of 28 ships into two columns, intending to divide and conquer the combined French and Spanish force of 33 ships. About noon that day, as they prepared for the confrontation, Admiral Nelson sent out one of the most famous commands of naval history: "England expects that every man will do his duty." While the British prevailed, destroying Napoleon's fleet in less than 4 hours' time. Nelson was fatally wounded by a sharpshooter, and the English Navy hero died just as victory was his. The brave Nelson had seen fate coming, the night before Trafalgar. He had revised his will, and just before the battle had begun, he told Captain Henry Blackwood, "God bless you, Blackwood, I shall never speak to you again." Nevertheless, Nelson died knowing that he had won, uttering the still famous words, "Thank God, I have done my duty."
What was the Munich Pact?
It was a failed effort to appease the territory and power-hungry German leader Adolf Hitler. 1889–1945, in the days leading up to World War II, 1939–45. After Germany annexed neighboring Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, it became known that Hitler had designs on the Sudetenland, a heavily German region of Czechoslovakia. With World War I, 1914–18, a fresh memory, and European nations still recovering from heavy losses, Europe's powers were eager to avoid another conflict. On September 29 and 30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich. They were joined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, a German ally, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, a Czech ally. Czechoslovakia did not have any representatives at the conference. The leaders quickly worked out a plan for Germany to occupy the Sudetenland. Chamberlain considered Czechoslovakia's concession a reasonable price to pay for peace on the continent. But the effort to assuage Hitler was not successful. In March 1939, Germany moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. On September 1, Germany marched into Poland, and World War II began.
What was the Brumaire coup d'état?
It was the overthrow on November 9, 1799, of the French revolutionary government. The coup put Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in power as one of three councils intended to head the government. While Napoleon was in Egypt and Syria waging what were for the most part successful military campaigns on behalf of the French government, there was growing discontent back home with the Directory. The group of 5 men who had governed France since 1795. His army stranded in the Middle East. Napoleon received word that France might soon be under attack by the Second Coalition. The second in a series of 6 alliances that formed in Europe in order to stave off French domination. Leaving another man in command of his troops, Napoleon hurried home where he was welcomed as a hero. Aided by his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, 1775–1840, and the French revolutionary leader Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, 1748–1836, Napoleon carried out a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory. A consulate was formed, with the young Napoleon becoming first consul. The other councils had little influence, acting primarily as advisors to the ambitious Napoleon. The coup marked the end of the French Revolution, after the chaos and violence of the previous decade. The French people looked to Napoleon as a strong leader who could bring order to the country. They did not know that the 30-year-old possessed a seemingly insatiable hunger for power, which would soon transform the government into a dictatorship. After a brief peace, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France on December 2, 1804. By which time he had already begun to wage a series of wars to gain himself more power in Europe.
Who were the code talkers?
Code talkers were Navajo Indians who provided secure communications for the U.S. military-specific operations during World War II, 1939–45. Serving in the Marines, the Navajo servicemen were recruited because of their language, which is unwritten and extremely complex. Military officials believed the Japanese would not be able to decipher intercepted communiques that were transmitted in the Navajo language. The first Navajo recruits attended boot camp in May 1942 and developed and memorized a dictionary of military terms to use in encrypting messages. The trained code talkers were deployed with Marine units throughout the Pacific Theater. They worked around the clock, with tremendous speed and accuracy, to transmit vital information about military tactics, battle orders, and troop movements. Their messages were sent over telephone and radio, because of the complexity of the language. The Japanese military was never able to break the code. About 400 Navajos served as code talkers during the war, contributing mightily to the success of U.S. military assaults at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and other Pacific venues.
What happened on Iwo Jima?
During the month of February 1945, Allied forces and the Japanese fought for control of Iwo Jima, a small island in the northwest Pacific Ocean, 759 miles south of Tokyo. Japan was using Iwo Jima as a base from which to launch air attacks on U.S. bombers in the Pacific. Capturing the island from the Japanese became a key objective for the United States. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th U.S. Marine Divisions invaded the island. Fighting over the next several days claimed more than 6,000 U.S. troops. On the morning of February 23, after a rigorous climb to the top of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima's 550-foot inactive volcano, U.S. Marines planted an American flag. Though small, it was visible from around the island. Later that day, a larger flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi by 5 Marines and a Navy hospital corpsman. The moment was captured by American news photographer Joe Rosenthal. His famous photo became the inspiration for the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, dedicated November 10, 1954, in Arlington, Virginia.
How did the Treaty of Versailles pave the way for World War II?
In the aftermath of World War I, 1914-18, Germany was severely punished. One clause in the Treaty of Versailles even stipulated that Germany take responsibility for causing the war. In addition to its territorial losses, Germany was also made to pay for an Allied military force that would occupy the west bank of the Rhine River, intended to keep Germany in check for the next 15 years. The treaty also limited the size of Germany's military. In 1921, Germany received a bill for reparations. It owed the Allies $33 million. While the post-war German government had been made to sign the Treaty of Versailles under the threat of more fighting from the Allies, the German people nevertheless faulted their leaders for accepting such strident terms. Not only was the German government weakened, but public resentment over the Treaty of Versailles soon developed into a strong nationalist movement led by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945.
What was the Sino-Japanese War?
This dispute between China and Japan, who had not that long ago clashed in the Chinese-Japanese War of 1894–95, began in 1937 and was absorbed by World War II, 1939–45. The trouble between the Asian powers began when Japan, having already taken Manchuria and the Jahal province from China, attacked China again. Though China was in the midst of internal conflict with the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. 1887–1975, fighting the Communists under Mao Zedong. 1893–1976, China turned its attention to fighting the foreign aggressor. The fighting between the two countries continued into 1941 before war was officially declared by China. In so doing, China was at war not only with the Japanese, but with Japan's Axis allies Germany and Italy as well. The conflict then became part of World War II, which ended with the surrender of Japan to the Allies in September 1945.
What are VE Day and VJ Day?
VE Day stands for Victory in Europe Day, and VJ Day stands for Victory over Japan Day. After the German surrender was signed in Reims, France, the headquarters of General Dwight D. Eisenhower 1890–1969, in the wee hours of May 7, 1945, U.S. President Harry S. Truman. 1884–1972, declared May 8 VE Day the end of the World War II fighting in Europe. But it was not until the Japanese agreed to surrender on August 14, 1945, that World War II ended. September 2, 1945, was declared the official VJ Day since it was then that Japan signed the terms of surrender on the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay.
Who were the Minutemen?
They were volunteer soldiers, ready to take up arms at a minute's notice, who fought for the American colonies against the British during the Revolutionary War. The Minutemen, who were trained and organized into the militia, are most well known for the battles at Lexington and Concord, on April 19, 1775, which marked the beginning of the war. They had been alerted to the approach of the British troops, or Redcoats, by the patriot Paul Revere, 1735–1818. After the fighting at Lexington and Concord, which left 250 British killed or wounded and about 90 Americans dead, word spread quickly of the fighting, and the Revolutionary War had begun.
Who said, "We have met the enemy and they are ours"?
It was Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, 1785–1819, who wrote the famous words in A letter to General William Henry Harrison. 1773 to 1841, after defeating the British at the Battle of Lake Erie on September 10, 1813. An improvised U.S. squadron commanded by Captain Perry, 28 years old, achieved the victory in the War of 1812 battle. The message he sent to Harrison, who later went on to become the 9th U.S. President, was: "We have met the enemy and they are ours, 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry received a gold medal and thanks from Congress for the victory.
What was the Reign of Terror?
It refers to the short but bloody period in French history that began in 1793 and ended July 1794. During this time, revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, 1758 to 1794, led a tribunal that arrested, tried, and put to death more than 17,000 people, most of them by guillotine. In the reforms that followed the 1789 oath of the Tennis Court and the capture of the Bastille, France was transformed into a constitutional state, and French subjects became French citizens. An elected legislature, the Constituent Assembly, was given control of the government. Robespierre was elected first deputy from Paris and was the leader of the Radical Popular Party. In this new era, those who had been associated with the old regime or those who opposed the French Revolution became the subjects of persecution. In January 1793, King Louis XVI, 1754 to 1793, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, 1755 to 1793, were executed, beginning the Reign of Terror that saw thousands more, mostly those who had made up the powerful First and Second Estates, suffer a similar fate at the hands of the revolutionaries. To escape certain death, many fled the country. This included top-ranking military officials, which made room for the rapid advancement of young military officers such as Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. The Reign of Terror ended on July 28, 1794, when Robespierre himself was put to death. As he gained power and influence, the revolutionary leader also had become increasingly paranoid, even putting 2 of his friends to death in 1794. He was overthrown on July 27 by the revolution of 9th Thermidor and the next day died by guillotine.
When did the Napoleonic Wars begin and end?
The Napoleonic Wars began shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, took power and lasted until 1815. When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Ever the general, Napoleon used his power to keep France at war throughout his reign. After the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire, November 1799, which had put Napoleon in power. At first he effected peace. In May 1800 he marched across the Alps to defeat the Austrians. ending the war with them that had begun 8 years earlier. Britain, fearing a growing European power on the continent, had declared war on France in 1793, by 1802, having grown tired of battle. The country agreed to peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Amiens. But the calm in Europe was not to last. By 1803 the diminutive but power-hungry Napoleon, nicknamed the Little Corporal, had begun to plot an invasion of Britain. Declaring himself emperor in 1804, he initiated a series of campaigns across Europe. And by 1806 most of the continent was under his control. He remained, of course, unable to beat the British, whose superior navy gave them supremacy at sea. But the various alliances, called coalitions, formed by European countries against Napoleon eventually broke him. After he had been defeated in Russia in 1812, the European powers that had long been held in submission by Napoleon formed a sixth and final coalition against him: Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, Prussia, and Austria met Napoleon's army at the momentous Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Poland. From October 16 to 19, 1813, Napoleon was defeated there in what is sometimes called the War of Liberation, and he retreated to France. The following March, the Allies making up the Sixth Coalition took Paris. Napoleon's generals were defeated. He abdicated the throne on April 6. However, that was not the end of the Napoleonic era. Exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. Believing he could recover power in the unstable atmosphere that followed his abdication. 3 months later he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars. He was exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died in 1821.
What was the Berlin airlift?
It was the response during 1948 and 1949 to the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. After World War II, 1939–45, the German city had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But following the conclusion of the war, it did not take long for the Cold War, 1947–89, between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to heat up. When the Americans, British, and French agreed to combine their 3 areas of Berlin into one economic entity, the Soviets responded by cutting the area off from all supply routes. In June 1948 all arteries, road, rail, and water into West Berlin were blocked by Soviet troops. Since Berlin was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, the Soviets clearly believed the blockade would be an effective move that would prompt the Western countries to pull out. But the move failed. The Americans, British, and French set up a massive airlift. For the next 11 months, West Berlin was supplied with food and fuel entirely by airplanes. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift ended by September.
Who was Generalissimo Franco?
Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, was the fascist leader of Spain from 1939 until 1973. He rose to power in the Spanish Civil War. 1936 to 39, as he led a rebel nationalist army against the loyalist forces. Capturing Madrid in 1939, Franco assumed the role of head of government. Though he and the nationalists had received considerable help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to win the Civil War, when fighting broke out in World War II. 1939 to 45, Spain stayed neutral, at least nominally so. In 1947, with the fighting in Europe over, Franco declared himself monarch of Spain and ruled as an authoritative dictator. 2 years before he died, he stepped down as head of state. Though he retained the title Generalissimo, meaning commander-in-chief. Franco named as his successor Prince Juan Carlos, 1938. When Franco died in 1975, Juan Carlos I became the first Spanish monarch to control Spain since his grandfather. King Alfonso XIII, 1886 to 1941, was deposed in 1931 to make way for the brief republic, which was later overthrown by Franco and the nationalists. King Juan Carlos played an important role in transforming Spain into a modern democracy.
How did World War II begin?
The war began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, which was soon crushed by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler's 1889 to 1945 war machine. But while the Nazis moved in from the west, Poland was under attack by the Soviets from the north and east. The events in the Eastern European country had set the stage for a major conflict. After Poland, the Germans moved into Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and France, taking control as they went. By June 1940 only Great Britain stood against Hitler, who was joined by Axis power Italy. Before long, fighting had spread into Greece and northern Africa. In June 1941 Germany invaded the Soviet Union, enlarging the scope of the conflict again. With the world's focus on war-torn Europe, Japan executed a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in December 1941, which drew Americans into the war. The war would not end until 1945.
What was the oath of the tennis court?
It was the oath taken in June 1789 by a group of representatives of France's Third Estate who, having been rejected by King Louis XVI, 1754 to 1793, and the First and the Second Estates, vowed to form a French National Assembly and write their own constitution. The pledge set off a string of events that began the French Revolution, 1789–99. French society had long been divided into three classes, called estates. Members of the clergy were the first estate, nobles comprised the second, and everyone else made up the third. When philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712–1778, came along and challenged the king's supreme authority by promoting the idea that the right to rule came not from God but from the people, it fueled the discontent felt by the long-suffering peasants and the prosperous middle class who paid most of the taxes to run the government but who had no voice in it. In short, these people were the disenfranchised third estate. A government financial crisis brought on by the expense of war forced King Louis XVI to reluctantly call a meeting of the representatives of all three estates, called the Estates General, which had last convened in 1614. During the May 5, 1789, meeting at Versailles, the Third Estate attempted to seize power from the nobility, the clergy, and the king by insisting that the three estates be combined to form a national assembly in which each member had one vote. Since the Third Estate had as many representatives as the other two combined, the people would at last have a voice. When the attempt failed, the representatives of the Third Estate gathered on a Versailles tennis court, where they vowed to change the government. Louis XVI began assembling troops to break up the meeting. Meantime, an armed resistance movement had begun to organize. The situation came to a head on July 14, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille in Paris.
What was the League of Nations?
The League of Nations was the forerunner to the United Nations. It was an international organization established by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, 1914–18. Since the United States never ratified that treaty, it was not a member. The League was set up to handle disputes among countries and to avoid another major conflict such as the Great War, which is how World War I was referred to until the outbreak of World War II. But the organization proved to be ineffective. It was unable to intervene in such acts of aggression as Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's conquest of Ethiopia during 1935 to 1936, and occupation of Albania in 1939, and Germany's takeover of Austria in 1938. The League of Nations dissolved itself during World War II, 1939–45. Though unsuccessful, the organization did establish a basic model for a permanent international organization.
What caused the Spanish Civil War?
From 1936 to 1939, two sides fought for control of Spain, the nationalists and the loyalists. The insurgent nationalists were aristocrats, military leaders, Roman Catholic clergy, and members of a political group called the Phalange Party. They were supported by Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Fascist Italy, under Benito Mussolini 1883 to 1945, in their effort to wrest control. The Loyalists were liberals, socialists, and communists. They were supported by the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin 1879 to 1953. A number of non-Spanish idealists, who believed saving the Republic from the fascist rebels was worth dying for, joined the ranks of the Loyalists to form the International Brigade. In his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway 1899 to 1961, who had covered the war as a correspondent, wrote about one young American man who took up arms in behalf of the Loyalist effort. The Nationalists, under Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, won the war when they captured Madrid in March 1939, beginning an era of harsh right-wing rule. And, as with any war, the fascist victory had come at a dear price. Hundreds of thousands dead and massive destruction throughout the country.
How was it that Anne Frank's diary survived World War II?
The young German Jewish girl's diaries, which chronicled 26 months of hiding from the German authorities in Amsterdam during World War II, 1939 to 45, were given to her father, Otto Frank, 1889 to 1980, when he returned to Holland from Auschwitz after the war. The notebooks and papers had been left behind by the secret police, and were found in the Frank family's hiding place by two Dutch women who had helped the fugitives survive. Otto Frank published his daughter's diaries in 1947. 20 years later, the English-language edition, The Diary of a Young Girl, was released. It was subsequently made into a play and a film, both called The Diary of Anne Frank. The diary is an astonishingly poignant account of the suffering and heroism during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Anne Frank, born in 1929, had known religious persecution her entire life. She was only 4 years old when her family escaped Nazi Germany in 1933 and fled to the Netherlands. During the Nazi occupation of that country, beginning in 1942, the Frank family hid in a secret annex behind her father's office at 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. It was there that Anne lived with 7 others for just more than 2 years, recording her thoughts in 3 notebooks. But the family was finally found, on August 4, 1944, by the Nazis, who arrested them and put them in German concentration camps. In March 1945, 2 months before the German surrender, Anne Frank died of typhoid fever in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Of the 8 who had hidden in the secret annex, Anne's father, Otto, was the only survivor.
Why did the Russians burn Moscow?
The September 14, 1812, torching of their own city was directed by Tsar Alexander I. 1777–1825, who wished to prevent Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821. And his invading armies from reaping the benefits of anything Russian. Through a series of wars, Napoleon had dominated most of Europe by 1805. The authority of Alexander was certainly threatened by the French emperor. In 1805 and 1807 Russia suffered major losses in battles with Napoleon's armies. In the face of these defeats, what Alexander did next was a stroke of genius. Though he had many detractors at the time, Napoleon's forces, though victorious, were weary from fighting and were unable to pursue the Russian armies further. So, Alexander made peace with the emperor in the Treaty of Tilsit, 1807. The Russian ruler vowed support of Napoleon, and for his part, Napoleon believed Alexander had extended him a hand of friendship. Instead, the cunning Russian ruler had bought himself and his country the time they needed to gird themselves against powerful Napoleon. By 1812 Russia, its economy dependent on exports, resumed trade with Great Britain, Napoleon's archenemy. This prompted the return of Napoleon's troops to Russia. Later that year the French emperor marched into Russia with a force of as many as 600,000 men, but the Russians still delivered Napoleon a crushing defeat. The Russian army had relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, including burning their own countryside. Napoleon returned to Paris in defeat by the end of the year.
What was Nazism?
Short for National Socialism, Nazi was a derisive abbreviation that held. The Nazi doctrine rests on three philosophies: extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. As one of the Central Powers, Germany's defeat in World War I, 1914–18, resulted in severe punishment of that country and its seriously diminished role in Europe. The doctrines of Nazism took hold there, appealing to the masses with promises of a rebuilt Germany. The Bible of Nazism was Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, 1923, which asserted the superiority of a pure Aryan race. Aryans are non-Jewish Caucasians, particularly those of Northern European descent. Led by an infallible ruler, called the Führer, the re-establishment of a German Empire, the Third Reich, and the systematic annihilation of people who Nazis perceived to be Germany's worst enemies, Jews and Communists. Nazis ruled Germany from 1933. When Hitler rose to power as head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In their own country, they enforced their policies through a secret police. The Gestapo, storm troops, called the SS, and Hitler's bodyguard, called the SA. Elsewhere in Europe, the Nazis used sheer force in imposing their system. Their aggression and ruthlessness resulted in World War II, 1939–45. During the Holocaust, 1933–45, Nazi soldiers, led by Hitler's henchmen, persecuted and exterminated upwards of 12 million people, at least half of whom were European Jews. Nazism ended in 1945, when Hitler killed himself and Germany lost the war. The doctrine, which demonstrated how detrimentally powerful a theory can be, was outlawed thereafter. Sadly, the late 20th century saw a resurgence of neo-Nazism among extremists in Germany and the United States.
Which countries comprised the Allies in World War II?
The three major Allied powers were Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union. Their leaders, Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, Franklin Roosevelt, 1880–1945, and Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, were referred to as the Big Three. They and their military advisors developed the strategy to defeat the Axis countries, though Stalin, for the most part, acted alone on the Soviet front. China, which had been at war with Asian rival Japan since 1937, also joined the Allies. 46 other countries became part of the Allied front before the war was over. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. And within days Great Britain entered into fighting against Germany. Australia, New Zealand, India, France, South Africa, and Canada also allied with Great Britain, as did Norway. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in 1940, all of them under siege by Nazi Germany. Greece entered the war later that year, as did Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union entered the war. And in the days after the Japanese bombing of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941, 12 more Allied countries became involved in the war, chief among them, the United States and China. The others, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, were all Caribbean and Latin American countries. Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Cuba, and Guatemala. The year 1942 saw 3 more countries join the Allies: Mexico in May, Brazil in August, and Ethiopia in December. In 1943 and 1944, in what were perhaps the darkest days of the war, Iraq, Bolivia, Iran, and Colombia signed on as Allied nations, followed by the tiny country of San Marino. Significant since it is situated wholly within the boundaries of Axis power Italy, Colombia, and Liberia. February and March of 1945 saw another wave of nations siding with the Allies. The South American countries of Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Chile, Venezuela, Uruguay, and Argentina, along with the Middle Eastern countries of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. Mongolia, the Mongolian People's Republic, in Central Asia, was the last to join the Allies. On August 9, 1945. Of course, the level of support each Allied nation lent to the war effort varied. But it was significant that the list of Allied nations grew longer with each year that the war was fought.
Who was Tokyo Rose?
Wartime radio broadcasts by a woman called Tokyo Rose were an Axis propaganda effort intended to weaken the resolve of American and Allied troops. The Japanese pressed into service Allied POWs and a woman named Eva Toguri d'Aquino, a U.S. citizen caught in wartime Japan, to read over the radio what were intended to be demoralizing messages to the Allied troops. Originating in Japan and heard by soldiers and sailors in the Pacific. The broadcasts were either disregarded by their intended audience or were found mildly amusing. Though d'Aquino was later convicted of treason. In 1977 President Gerald Ford issued an unconditional pardon in the case, which was built on tainted facts. The Axis powers did the same sort of broadcasts from Germany, where Axis Sally aired messages that were heard throughout Europe.
Were all the battles of the American Revolution waged in the Northeast?
No, there was also fighting in the southern colonies. But the struggle between the American colonists and the British was further complicated in the South by the presence of slaves. Landowners feared that any fighting in the vicinity would inspire slaves to revolt against them. Knowing this, the British believed they could regain control of the southern colonies more readily than those in the north. In November 1775 the British governor of Virginia offered to free any slaves who would fight for the British. As many as 2,000 black slaves accepted the offer and took up arms. But there were also patriots in the South. It was Virginian Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, who uttered the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." In late February 1776 Patriot forces confronted and defeated pro-British colonists near Wilmington, North Carolina. The British troops who were sailing from Boston, Massachusetts, to North Carolina to join the loyal colonists arrived too late to help. They instead sailed on to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also the scene of fighting that summer.
Why was the Battle of Midway important in World War II?
It was the turning point for the Allied forces fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. The battle for Midway Island, actually two small islands situated about 1,300 miles west-northwest of Honolulu, Hawaii, began on June 4, 1942. The Japanese aimed to control Midway as a position from which its air force could launch further attacks on Hawaii. As the Japanese fleet approached the islands, which was home to a U.S. Navy base, established in 1941, U.S. forces attacked. Fighting continued until June 6. The Japanese were decisively defeated, losing 4 aircraft carriers. The United States lost 1. The victory proved that Allied naval might could overcome Japan's.
What is NATO?
NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed on April 4, 1949, when 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The original 12 NATO countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each member nation agreed to treat attacks on any other member nation as if it were an attack on itself. In other words, any aggressor would have to face the entire alliance. This was NATO's policy of deterrence, a way of discouraging any attacks by the Soviet Union or other Eastern Bloc countries. The organization had the further benefit of discouraging fighting among the member countries. 3 years after it was formed, the alliance was joined by Greece and Turkey, in 1952. West Germany followed 3 years after that, in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of communism and the reunification of East and West Germany, c. 1990, all of Germany joined the alliance. At this point, with the Cold War, 1947–89, over, many wondered what purpose the organization could serve. After all, the Soviet threat was no longer existent. However, other conflicts loomed on the horizon, including those in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Fearing the civil war in the former Yugoslav Republic would spread, NATO sent in troops on the side of the Bosnian government. NATO also formed the Partnership for Peace in 1994. This program was joined by more than 20 countries, including former Eastern Bloc nations, including Russia. Though these nations are not full members in the NATO alliance, the Partnership for Peace provides for joint military planning among signing nations. On March 12, 1999, 3 former Eastern Bloc nations were given full membership in NATO: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Observers hailed the additions as evidence that Europe is becoming more unified. On April 23, 1999, the 50th anniversary of the alliance's founding, the 19 NATO member nations gathered in Washington, D.C., to commemorate the event, just after NATO had begun air bombing Yugoslavia. To pressure the government there to accept international terms aimed at bringing peace to the nation's Kosovo province, where ethnic conflicts between Serbs and Albanians had turned deadly. NATO is governed by the North Atlantic Council, which is made up of the heads of government of member nations or their representatives. It was headquartered in Paris until 1967, at which time the offices were moved to Brussels, Belgium.
What was Lend-Lease?
Lend-Lease was a plan, developed and strongly supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, to extend material assistance to the Allied powers fighting the Axis powers in World War II. 1939 to 45, in the days preceding U.S. involvement in the war. Roosevelt argued that it was imperative for the country to come to the aid of those fighting Germany and Italy. It was similar to helping your neighbor put out a fire in his house in order to prevent your own house from catching fire and burning. Under Lend-Lease, which was passed by Congress on March 11, 1941, approximately $50 billion of aid in the form of food and supplies, weapons, machinery, and other equipment was provided to the Allied nations, primarily to Britain and the Commonwealth nations first, but later to all nations fighting against Hitler's war machine. The return of the goods was not addressed until after the war had ended. At that time, most people felt the Allies had all contributed everything they had to the war effort, and that the sacrifices made by Allied Europe in the days prior to U.S. entry into the fighting were balanced by the contributions made under the Lend-Lease Act.
What was the Enola Gay?
It was the American B-29 bomber that dropped the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, Japan, to drop a bomb over the city. The explosion killed an estimated 80,000 people and leveled an area of about 5 square miles in Hiroshima, an important manufacturing and military center. Thousands more died later from radiation exposure.